just to say, unfortunately, the kind of notes that I had, the presenter notes, aren't visible. So if there's any like really long, pregnant and awkward pauses, that's because I'm trying to remember what the hell I was going to say. But yeah, so anyway, it's lovely to be here. Lovely to, yeah, I did a talk at BC 2019, and so it's lovely it's poetic, you know, to be back again, talking about something very similar, kind of the same, but different. And that's what my good friend Sarah Janes basically wrapped up my whole PhD as, in terms of the comparison between psychedelics and near-death experiences. Just in a nutshell, 4 years. So basically, they're the same, but different. Okay, great, yeah. Which is basically what it is. Spoiler, and goodbye. Yeah, so let's just get actually stuck in. So Bards of the Bardos is to kind of express that what I'll really be focusing on in this talk, at least, is a survey. And it's a survey of people who've had both psychedelic and near-death experiences. It's in collaboration with Imperial College, Chris Timmerman, and Coma Science Group at University of Liège with Charlotte Martial. And but my bit is the qualitative stuff. So how these people are expressing these rather inexpressible states. They're bards in a way. They're really valiantly trying to F the ineffable. So NDE memetics, again, kind of just alluding to that kind of spoiler of really what the whole thing is all about, is that it's a term I kind of came up with in my PhD, that my PhD focused on DMT, whereas this survey is going to be many different substances. But the idea that while there are many comparabilities between psychedelics and near-death experiences, it's a mimesis. They're not thanatogens or kind of necrotogens. They're kind of, you know, that generate identical experiences, but there are overlapping dimensions. So this is just a kind of quick slideshow of abstracts of literature that have previously gone into this dialectic, this relationship between psychedelics and near-death experiences. So, for instance, kind of roughly chronological, ibogaine and ibogaine, how they're similar in some respects, and interesting kind of allusions to the protective mechanisms of psychedelics, endogenous psychedelics. Ayahuasca, and we had a little bit about that from Graham Hancock, the similarities phenomenologically between ayahuasca and near-death experiences. Ketamine, this was a good study using the kind of standard scale, measuring near-death experiences between two different groups, people who've had kind of authentic near-death experiences and ketamine-induced ones. But it was retrospective. DMT models of near-death experience by Chris, and that was within a kind of double-blind placebo trial, so prospective, doing the same as the ketamine one I showed earlier, ultimately showing that according to that scale, when you approach it in that manner, quantitatively, then each kind of feature of the near-death experience between DMT and NDMT and near-death experience is essentially statistically indistinguishable from each other. This is a paper of mine that will be, hopefully, well, it's essentially kind of in review at the moment. You could say it's a kind of response to Chris's paper. Instead of looking at it in terms of just this questionnaire, it is doing it qualitatively. And when you look at it qualitatively, it certainly reveals that the nuances of the phenomenology, the experience, that the kind of so-called content is actually quite radically different between DMT and near-death experiences. Again, that's in the book I think you all got. My chapter is about high-dose psilocybin being, at least this particular participant that I focused on, being very similar, even qualitatively, to the near-death experience. Not going to go into this. That's basically my PhD in a slide. But it's a qualitative, quantitative analysis of DMT and near-death. yes, but the thing, and I've sort of given you the overview of what the conclusion of that was, but this is an interesting revision of the idea that I had. Originally with the PhD, it was, sorry, I kind of realised I want to be my back to a bit. I'm really sorry about that. I'm going to try and recalibrate. The original idea was that you could look at the two experiences qualitatively and you could kind of develop or desubstantiate the idea that endogenous DMT could give rise to the near-death experience. But it's not really great to do that qualitatively. You should just, and in fact, Dean et al. 2019 did that with rats. Unfortunately, sacrificed the rats, measured the DMT in the brain, and it was indeed increased. But it's a better way of framing my PhD is that it's the way, if you're taking the phenomenology seriously, then it's sort of better to look at it as thinking whether or not the experience in and of itself between a psychedelic experience and the death state is actually similar. And I think when you do that, although it seems similar, it's very different because it can lend itself to ideas of whether or not when you take have a psychedelic experience, are you glimpsing into what you may really experience when you die, or empathize somehow with when deceased loved ones, or when loved ones pass away, for instance, more meaningful, I think. So this idea kind of from mechanism to meaning. From the horse's mouth, right, so just saying nay, remember? So in terms of studies looking at people who've had both psychedelic and near-death experiences separately, there's really not much at all, but Janssen in this book did have two participants, I think one of which himself, who had both experiences, basically saying they're the same. And there was also one by Groff in 1994, Alternative Cosmologies of Psychology, something of that nature, where an LSD participant then subsequently had a near-death experience in surgery or something, and then reported that they were the same. But the whole point of this survey is to kind of give greater rigor to that, more participants, much more in-depth qualitative analyses. So obviously, hence the horse's mouth thing, go straight to source. Are they similar? Let's talk to the people who've actually had both of these experiences. And that really does actually valuably supplement any kind of third-person analysis, such as like I myself as a researcher, I've got both experiences, I can analyze them, see how similar they are or not. You can do that, but then also actually, what did they say about it? And some papers of mine that I'll go through a little bit they're different, and so they need to be supplemented. Okay, so this is the first of those. This is a well-known near-death experiencer. He also then subsequently had a 5-MeO DMT experience. It was the near-death experience was from coma from meningoencephalitis. He actually said that his experience was actually very dissimilar when you look at how he rated them himself. But then when I analysed them thematically, all of these fundamental mystical experience dimensions, such as transcendence of time, ego dissolution, unitivity and stuff, they were identical essentially between his NDE and 5-MeO. But then there were loads of these other features of his NDE which weren't present in the 5-MeO. And that's kind of predictable because 5-MeO is quite classically contentless in a way, is this kind of classic mystical experience. Contentless is an interesting nuance there. It could be considered like contentful. There was so much neuroscience I wanted to go into, as that's kind of my background, but I actually had to skip those slides and stuff. But I'm just going to skip that last bit, other than to just say it doesn't necessarily. It could imply if there's this subset of the experience being very, very similar, that 5-MeO endogenously could produce it, but it's kind of superfluous. It's not really necessary. The brain can do that in kind of other ways if you take that reductionist view. Changa is the combination of DMT in harmala alkaloid-containing plants, which have MAOIs, so it's kind of like smokable ayahuasca. And so I had two case studies in this paper who had both Changa and NDEs. And they said, well, the first individual said that it was actually very, very similar, versus my own thematic analysis that actually said it was actually not very similar. And it's basically a similar situation for the second participant. So it's interesting, you need both of these approaches to get a kind of confusing but overarching picture. So only 2 people, so we need more data, hence the survey. So finally getting onto the survey, Bards of Bardos. So quant and qual, as I mentioned, I'll be doing the qual stuff, and yes, it's with Charlotte and Chris. 25 participants, but the survey link is open, so email me if any of you guys have actually had both experiences, so we can have more data. 20, so that's was 25, but it had to be reduced because a few people had misnomer sort of NDE, such as, you know, they got almost hit by a car, but, you know, that's the kind of misnomer NDE. The idea is that you are actually having an experience when proximal to death. So ultimately we've got 15. All of those 15, so each of them have got both of these experiences. Just some sort of demographics and details. So in terms of the NDE, the score that they had, which kind of, you know, is measuring their near-death experience using this latest version of the NDE scale, it ranged from about 29 to 67, which is out of 80, averaged at 47 out of 80. And from a smorgasbord of different precipitators or triggering contexts, as you can read there, chronic depression was actually one which is interesting. Is it an NDE experience or what's being kind of considered as like an NDE-like experience? But it's interesting because there is some real physical experiences that happen. This person reported that it sort of seemed to overlap with chronic fatigue, so it could well have some physical concomitant there. Most of them actually did, during the experience, believe that they were dying, and that's important because there could well be kind of expectation effects within the experience, which could actually partially drive the experience. That's important to consider. In terms of the psychedelic experience, interestingly, the score on this standardized measure that measures NDEs was pretty similar to the kind of NDE propers, just sort of, you know, few marks lower, as it were. Different psychedelics, interestingly, thus far at least, no DMT or 5-MeO, which is great because I did that for 3.5 years, so I can move on to different substances. LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, iboga. Again, the cannabis thing, is it a psychedelic or not? Interesting, apparently everything is, so I think we're good there. Belief that you're dying is about half the number of people that had that believe they did in the near-death experience, which is, again, like I said, important to consider for these kind of possible expectation effects. So, third-person comparison. This is me doing a really, really detailed thematic analysis. So when I say third person, I mean that's basically I'm that person doing that. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is just to give you an idea. I will focus on 2 sort of more, or at least, yeah, hopefully I've got time for 2. But just to gloss over now, what this is the list of themes, basically. So on the left, you've got the near-death experience. On the right, you've got psychedelic experience. And it's, so the gaps basically mean that there isn't the corresponding experience. So other than the red highlighted one, if that makes sense. So in the near-death experience, for instance, they had this sense of like clarity or alertness of mind. They didn't have that in the LSD experience, and then you can go through down. I hope that makes sense. So what was similar was a sense of peace and freedom. Yeah, so the most important point here is that they are very dissimilar because there's no overlapping themes other than the odd red highlighted one, which was the same between them. Right? These are all different, one of these 15 individuals, and there are not these overlapping themes. So I'll go in detail between two experiences. That's basically just tabulating the similarities. So I guess what's important is that of all of the 15, there are two. There's peace, panic, and the entity encounter, at least so far in the analysis, which has come up as the same in 2 individuals, right? Which is not a lot. So it's not very similar when you're looking at the third-person thematic analysis. I guess the important thing to highlight is that this is you could be considered more of a content analysis. So it's very detailed, how it differs to the questionnaire DMT models in near-death experience, for instance. That's how many items is it? 16 items. So very broad themes, like did you encounter an entity? Did you go to another space? Very, very broad. This is looking at themes of how each of those different items on that questionnaire could manifest. So that could be, so this is again, it's reiterating the basic conclusion of my PhD is that when you do look at this level of content on the quality of experience, then suddenly the 2 experiences look fundamentally different. So what's the time, Will? How much time do I have left? 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. All right, so I think I'll focus on one. If I remember, oh yeah, it would be nice to have some quotes. Yes, thank you for that. So just to give you an idea, actually reading some of the quality of these experiences. So this is an individual who OD'd, and then also it was quite a graphic suicide attempt. And then subsequently they had a high-dose psilocybin experience. So first, we've got the NDE. So what happened was, she said, I was observing my body from above. My sense of self was absorbed into a greater everything. There was no me to observe and articulate. I contracted painfully into self, and that was immersed in the most horrifying aggregation of pain of my life and beyond, floating in void for eternity, terrifying. Then I gravitated towards a voice. It was that of a random person from my past, no contact with in waking life. But in his presence, I flashed back through the events of my whole life in just seconds, and he made it clear to me that I had a choice, and my future was not set. I'd have a chance to return and shape a different life than just floating in endless void. I saw flickers of my future, which were more like feelings than actual visions or stories. Those feelings were certain for me. I immediately chose to live. So I could deconstruct that and interpret that in many, many different ways, but the point is to compare with the psilocybin experience. So this is her psilocybin experience. The feeling of sinking into something unknown was frightening. Felt very similar to when I was sliding out of myself during the NDE. So again, we can kind of see at least some kind of parity there, which is sort of highlighted in the thematic list there in orange. I was afraid that I was dying. Quite a good comparability there on the sort of foundational level of things. Relief, weightlessness, freedom to merge with a greater consciousness. I was held in the feminine, godlike embrace that felt like Mother Earth, infinite, abundant. I was able to ask questions about people in my life and my work in the world to this all-knowing mother. I felt a deep healing with my wounds around my mother and my physical body, deep sense of peace and relaxation. So that's just one example, but a very representative example of these 15 participants, which is also mirroring just this kind of more bland list of themes, to give you a sense of the actual quality of these experiences being really quite fundamentally different. As I said, the similarities come in these broader constructs, such as the highlighted entity encounter there. So both, what was certainly the case is that she encountered an entity in both. Okay, and there could be interesting reasons for this. Is it because they just have a very high-dose psychedelic experience and a quite shallow near-death experience, or is it because they have a really deep near-death experience, significant precipitating factors, but actually, they're just microdosing psychedelics or what have you? And that wasn't actually the case, which was intriguing, but a couple of them didn't have the perception of death in their psilocybin, which is interesting, like I said, because there could be these psychological reasons for them being similar if you just think that you're dying. and also some of them didn't have a great repertoire of past psychedelic experience to build on, and that could arguably mean that it kind of limits their ability to calibrate. And if they did have very many, it could mean that they were more similar than different. But that's kind of conjecture. So what about what they actually said? Again, because of time, I'm not going to read everything, but this is what they said, and first focusing on the similarities coming from their own appraisal of things, of the parallels. So firstly, emotion was quite similar, and especially positive emotions, so joy, love, bliss, preciousness of life. Which is interesting. It could possibly be that emotion, again, contentious kind of conjecture, but there's not as much content in emotion per se. It's just a matter of valence, and it's on a spectrum, so that could just be why there's more similarity there. But differences were, even in the first-person accounts, they were more marked than the similarities. So this, I guess the most important one was this idea that they repeatedly reiterated, that it felt like the ND was kind of death proper, as it were. So I'll read a few of these quotes. So one of the individuals, respondent 252, I was fully in the afterlife. The ND was entirely real. It's been several years. I still feel changed from it. And that was compared to their psychedelic experience, where they felt they're only transferred to inexistent realms of hallucinations on psychedelics. So we got the sense of the reality of it, this kind of noetic sense of it, the fact that they really felt it was the afterlife. Similarly, with these other participants, that is where you go when you die. I was told so by the entities. Without a single doubt, being to where we go when we die, compared to the psychedelic, which is, yes, they felt they may actually have gone to a different dimension, which is interesting. So there's some level of reality about it, but it wasn't the place you go to when you actually die. So these quotes is reiterating this idea. And again, one of the most important differences that they themselves espoused was this idea, which I've kind of dubbed as near-death experiences save your life, because they're more transformative. So this respondent said, it made me want to live, and it healed years of self-harm and suicidality. I'd been institutionalized for 2 years, and it marked the moment when I decided to live. The NDE changed my life. I no longer feared death. This has made me respect life and others more. I felt I was enlightened for several months. So more transformative. And yeah, I kind of put these thoughts together a couple of years prior to this survey, in this paper that's published with the British Psychological Society. This idea that NDEs they're kind of classic conversion experiences, and you could curate psychedelic experiences to mirror them more and kind of optimize, as it were, the therapeutic outcome, as well as other points. So yeah, again, even looking from the first-person perspective, there's this emphasis on the difference between them. And again, it could be because of this disparity between the contexts of both types of experiences, but that wasn't really the case, actually, for all the participants. But like I said, some of them didn't have the actual perception of death, and it's possible that could have exaggerated the differences, but that was a minority, and we don't know if that's really effective. Again, just quantitatively, that just mirrored the qualitative stuff, in that you can see that the vast majority of the people of the respondents said that it was the ND which had a greater impact on their life. So what does it all mean? Basil, the first-person ratings, according to looking at what they themselves said from the horse's mouth, the differences were more described, both within the qualitative answers, within their own ratings of the differences, as well as the choice of which was more impactful. And again, as you saw from the list of all of the thematic the themes, that there was very little overlap. I mentioned some of the reasons that this could be, but in terms of the consequences, I didn't focus on them, but we kind of divided things into the actual experience itself and how they were similar or not, and how they were, and what the consequences were. And there's a disparity in the consequences between them, but it could potentially be because the differences in setting and preparation and integration for the psychedelic experience, or even the conditions of the near death, for the psychedelic ones, perhaps there wasn't that, but there's some of that data in the qualitative stuff that I need to sift and corroborate that or not. In terms of why the experience is different, I went in, there's my whole last chapter, my discussion, my thesis, my discussion going into lots of the neuroscience of why the experience themselves could be different. And in short, it's because actually at the point of death, there's a real gamut slew of psychobiological processes that are happening compared to just kind of suffusing your nervous system with a psychedelic. And in terms of comparability, how much time? Awesome. In terms of comparability, what was actually similar, they themselves did actually say that the intensity and the effect on metaphysical beliefs was potentially similar. This is kind of it is one of the most interesting questions, but we like what's his name from the GIF that I showed earlier, the Magnum dude. We do need more data, unfortunately, in order to answer this question: what psychedelic of these psychedelics is actually most like near-death experience? Because we need each group having an experience with a different psychedelic to be large in order to answer that interesting question. Just quickly, last couple of slides. Really, again, a really interesting question that was asked of them. Do you think that you will actually experience something similar to your psychedelic experience when you die? And interestingly, only half of them said yes. And you'd think that maybe the people who are more likely to say yes to that are actually those that had a similar experience. But the point really of this is that they themselves even did not think that they were similar experiences. So there wasn't really much of a correlation there. Just to signpost this great paper, which really does emphasize that it's important not just to look at the narratives and quantitatively look at them and how similar or different they are. These people are like human beings who've had very transformative experiences, that have utterly changed their lives, coming from really often deeply traumatic histories, not just the context of the ND itself. And so to look at the experiences biographically, context and consequences is super important. And just interesting that it's not just the difference between experience before and afterward, but if people like this individual, who've one of our most ill psychiatrically participants, actually stated that I did not feel psychotic during the NDE, which is fascinating. So even acutely, these NDEs seem to be very psychotherapeutic, and again, really traumatic history. Didn't care if they lived or died, heroin overdose, and yet had this OBE suffused with transcendent peace. And so, like this, although this PowerPoint has kind of suggested that the differences outweigh the similarities, that's just thus far, and only in when you look at analyses on a certain level. And so if there is this comparability with psychedelics and near-death experiences, what is the potential for psychedelics for psychosis? And Bruce Grayson has done a study which kind of alludes to the possibility of that. And there are papers, and there was a person talking today about that, which unfortunately I didn't see because AI and entities are just too interesting. Okay, thank you so much.